10.
Kai straddled her waist, throwing his weight forward to pin her wrist to the ground beside her head, preventing her from clawing his face off as she reacted to his sudden attack.
"Idiot!" he snapped into her face. "What do you think you're doing?"
The fire in her blood exploded. Kai was here now? To what? Keep her from getting in trouble after letting her take all of Qigong's rebuke? Suddenly, her pent-up anger and frustration of the last 2 days focused in on the man pinning her to the ground. She snarled as she tried to twist her hands free of his grip. Kai leaned forward more, gritting his teeth, and his movement was enough for Aranya to bring her knees up and knock him off balance. "Get off me!" He vanished. Her talons tore into thin air. She leapt to her feet, whirling for any sign of him. Something hard hit the back of her knees, making them buckle as Kai slammed a hand down on her shoulder. The blow knocked her to the ground painfully. She rolled with the momentum, cursing, and swiped her talons straight at his arm. She barely avoided knocking into the landlord. Yaya's voice cut through the blood roaring in her ears.
"Aranya, are you all right?"
She was too busy to respond. Kai evanesced again. She knew instinctively he had appeared behind her again, so she jabbed her elbow hard up behind her. It connected between 2 ribs, and he let out a grunt. But then he snatched her wrist and wrenched it behind her with a hard twist. She cried out in pained surprise, but flexed her talons, trying to angle them so she could drive them into his flesh.
"Control yourself," he growled. "You'll get yourself dismissed with this behavior."
"And wouldn't you love that?" Aranya retorted, hooking her foot around his ankle and hauling him off balance again. The grip on her wrist and the presence behind her vanished. She yanked her hand back, nearly cutting herself on her own claws.
"I would, but not like this,"
he snapped, reappearing in front of her and grabbing her wrists. He wasn't fast enough. One of her talons scraped down his jaw. Blood welled along the thin line. His eyes flashed, meeting hers. Then he snarled and rammed her backward into the tenement wall. She let out an oof and curled her hands to stab her talons into his arms. Sweat beaded on his forehead with the effort to hold her back from skewering him.
"I will have you all fined for this!"
the landlord shrieked. Aranya glared up into Kai's stupidly beautiful eyes, so close to hers. His were full of anger, sharpened and glittering, glaring back. They both panted through open mouths, chests heaving in time with one another. Blood dripped off his chin from where she'd sliced him. Her muscles quaked as she strained against his grip, trying to break free. She twisted her neck to the side so she wasn't trapped in his attention. She squeezed her eyes shut, took stock of her position, ignored the roaring of her blood. If she moved fast enough, brought her knee up sharply enough, she could break free. Something soft and fluffy bumped up against her calf. She tore her attention away from Kai and glanced down to see a purring cat rubbing his face into the top of her boots. The white tail flicked her knee and then wrapped around her calf as he stepped over the toes of her boots to keep rubbing. Something shifted within her. Not only her claws, but something in her blood changed. The urge to fight faded away into nothing. She gasped, her gaze darting between Yaya curling around her feet and purring, Kai still restraining her against the door, and Leigh shouting in the yard. Her head sagged. Her muscles dissolved into quivering. For a long moment, Kai didn't move. He stared at her steadily, his weight heavy against her. Then he released his grip on her wrists and stepped back, pressing his sleeve against the cut on his jaw. The usual sly glint in his eye was gone, replaced by thinly veiled anger. Aranya scooped up Yaya and held the purring cat in her arms. He nuzzled into her neck softly. A sudden urge to cry hit her, but she swallowed quickly and held her composure. Yaya was fine. The landlord hadn't hurt him. And Kai had kept her from doing something she would have regretted. Could she have actually hurt Leigh? Would she have become the very person she arrested during the day? The thought made her shudder and hugged the fluffy bundle in her arms tighter. Why was she so reckless? Why couldn't she control herself?
Fines! All of you are fined!
Leigh was shrieking.
9 tangus from you, Swan Aranya, for the gardening, the threats, and the battle in my yard. 3 tangus from you too, Shi Kai.
9? She cried, one hand moving unconsciously to the coins under her clothes. If she paid the fine now, she wouldn't have enough for rent later. Desperation clawed at her throat, and she had to fight another swell of tears as she set Yaya back down on the ground. Fathers, she was exhausted. Kai had already unfastened the cord around his neck and was sliding off 2, not 3, coins. Her eyes bugged at the sight of 4 gold tangus hanging amid the ample supply of copper tangus. Her own cord was pitifully sparse. He had enough to pay both of their fines and not care. It must have been nice coming from a family like his.
You're welcome for saving your life,
Kai muttered as he slapped the coins into Leigh's outstretched palm. Leigh frowned at them, but shockingly didn't protest. Handing over 9 whole tangus was agony, and she was forced to set the cat down while she did it. But Aranya told herself she should be thankful that Leigh hadn't evicted her. Should be thankful Yaya wasn't hurt. The sun is about to set. A fresh blossom of anxiety unfurled in her chest, adding to the bouquet she already held close. She turned, lip between her teeth, toward Kai as he peeled his boots off by the door. We need to hurry if we're going to make it to Konkai Lake in time.
Meow.
Yaya's head twisted around to look at her. Kai paused, holding one boot in his hand. He stared at her, expressionless, for a long minute, his sleeve still pressed to the cut on his jaw. She forced herself not to fidget or falter under his gaze. He lifted one eyebrow, then the edge of his mouth quirked.
You're still up for it after wasting so much energy fighting me?
She didn't deign to respond. He broke eye contact to look down at his bare feet, giving a single snort. Then he lifted his gaze back to hers, raised an eyebrow, and vanished out of the doorway.
Kai!
Aranya burst out.
I still have to feed my grandfather.
But Kai reappeared at her side while she was still speaking, bent double, and scooped up Yaya into his arms. Aranya's eyes went wide as she flung out her hands toward her grandfather, but Kai was already carrying him inside, his back to her.
What are you doing? Put him down!
Kai ignored her as she stumble-hopped out of her boots at the door, wincing at her blisters, and hurried after him. Yaya's tail flicked contentedly, and she just knew he was purring at the attention. To no one's surprise, Kai didn't ask which unit their tenement was. He just marched straight to the right one. If there had ever been doubt about the wet boots, there wasn't now. When he reached the door, he opened it and strode right in. Aranya's eyes widened again as panic hit her sharply. Their tenement was a disaster. Had she left her undergarments in sight? Oh, father, she probably had. They were probably hanging from the screen.
You can just put him down,
she called ahead, trying not to let her voice sound too high-pitched.
Thank you for bringing him in. I'll take it from here.
Let's get you something to eat, said Kai to Yaya, giving him a good long scratch under his chin. Yaya purred in response, arching his back into Kai's neck and flicking his tail again. Aranya's face flushed hotter by the second as she stood in the doorway, watching her rival gingerly dodge all the overflowing boxes and piles of clothes.
I'll feed him, Kai. Don't trouble yourself.
Her eyes darted to the screen by the window, and mortification sent her tripping over boxes to get to the screen and hide the undergarments that were prominently displayed for all eyes to see. But while Kai and his long limbs had easily navigated the disaster, she wasn't quite so lucky, moving as frantically as she was. She stumbled, slammed her toe into a box, and went sprawling. She barely shifted her hands into lizard pads fast enough to catch herself on the wall. Gritting her teeth against the pain as hair fell in her face, she slowly twisted her neck to find Kai on one knee, his arm dangling from his propped elbow. Beside him, Yaya sat in human form on his mat by the fire. They both blinked at her. Kai lifted a brow. Then he turned back to Yaya.
"How do noodles sound? Aranya, do you have noodles around here somewhere?"
Yaya chuckled, eyes crinkling.
"What a nice young man. Where'd you find him, Sunflower?"
At that, Kai, who had gotten up and begun rifling through the boxes near the stove, turned fully to face Aranya as she straightened next to the screen. She swallowed and forced a helpless smile onto her face. "Please don't look at the screen." Kai raised both eyebrows at her and said with a grin,
"Sunflower?"
Yaya chuckled. Aranya winced. "Noodles are by the eggs," she said. "But really, Kai, I can—"
"Enough of your fussing,"
said Yaya, waving his hand and gesturing toward Kai's turned back.
"Let him join us."
Just when Aranya was about to grab the garments and fling them behind the screen, Kai glanced over his shoulder. She shoved her arms to her side, trying to not look suspicious. He only smirked at her and nodded as though in agreement with Yaya. She shot him a return glare, mouthing, "What are you doing?" He grinned and went back to lighting the stove. She took that moment to snatch her garments and toss them to safety. Then she exhaled, closing her eyes, trying to calm her heart rate. Opening them again, she found Yaya smiling happily at Kai as he heated water over the stove. She swallowed, drew in a deep breath, and much more carefully made her way toward her rival. As Kai began chopping vegetables, she bit her lip and glanced nervously at Yaya. Twice, she opened her mouth again to say he should leave this to her, and twice she forced it shut. But why? Why was he doing this?
"How was your day at work?"
asked Yaya. "Not now." Aranya paused halfway between Yaya and Kai, scratched her neck, and forced her voice to lighten as she said, well, we—" She trailed off, glancing uncertainly at Kai. He just kept working on their dinner. Maybe he knew this would make her feel extraordinarily awkward, and that was why he was doing it, trying to put her off balance. She would just have to show that she wasn't flustered. "It was a pretty normal day for the most part," she said, shrugging. Kai's head swung to the side, enough for him to fix her with an incredulous look. "This is Shi Kai, by the way," she said to Yaya. "He's one of my comrades. We worked together today." The knife came down on an onion in a particularly loud chop. Aranya couldn't help ducking her head to hide her smile.
"Is that so?"
asked Yaya. "That is so," replied Aranya, unable to resist goading Kai further. "I went on an investigation today, and since he's new too, he decided to come along." Suddenly, Kai was right in front of her, a blandly pleasant expression on his face. She jumped in surprise, one hand lifting to shapeshift instinctively. Something poked her stomach. She glanced down to find him pressing the cutting board with a knife and half-chopped onion to her.
"How about you take it from here?"
He flashed what she was certain was an imitation of one of her smiles.
"Sunflower."
She grabbed the board, glaring up at him. Gripping the knife by the handle, she lifted it so it pointed in his face. "Don't call me that." Kai, unfazed, bypassed her to sit cross-legged next to Yaya. Aranya tried not to huff as she made her way to the kitchen area, turning her back on them. When she checked the pot of boiling noodles, she discovered Kai had added enough for himself, too. Shaking her head, she went to work. Lieutenant Swin, began Kai. The title made Aranya blink.
Oh, no need for that, said Yaya. Call me Yaya.
What? Aranya sputtered voicelessly over the stove.
Very well,
came Kai's reply, and it sounded like he was smiling.
Where did your military campaigns take you, Yaya?
Deep breaths, deep breaths.
Bootoggan, mostly. It's so cold up there. Couldn't blame them for trying to expand their border southward, now could you? If my rump was always that frozen, I'd have done the same thing. Yeah. It's nice, you know, to have a young one like my sunflower who can keep me updated on the happenings about the Empire. I tell you, the older I get, the more I miss. Back when my legs behaved, I'd always go to the markets in Suguan to hear the news. But now I just sit here, and if not for her, I'd not know the Empire was burned to the ground until this tenement caught fire.
Oh, don't exaggerate, Yaya, said Aranya, hesitating over the salt bin, contemplating whether she ought to cook up a little meat since Kai was here. You'd find out long before then.
She always gives me more credit than I'm due,
said Yaya in a loud whisper to Kai.
She's a good girl that way.
I do not.
I'm sure she gives credit where credit is due,
said Kai diplomatically. Why was he being so nice? Perhaps this was his secret to staying out of trouble at the academy. She added a pinch of dried Tianjin peppers to a pouch and dropped it into the pot. That was when an idea hit her. A way to repay Kai's prank. With a glance over her shoulder to make sure Kai's attention was focused back on Yaya, she took an extra pinch of the dried peppers and put them directly in Kai's empty bowl.
She's a good girl, said Yaya. Keeping up with her old grandfather, working so hard all the time. She was such a diligent student at the academy.
Yeah.
Not many young folk would take such good care of their grandfather these days, said Yaya.
Indeed, said Kai.
7 valleys, Yaya. You make it sound like you're an inconvenience.
Oh, come now.
Aranya spun to face them, a wooden spoon clenched in her fist. She waved it threateningly at Yaya's innocent smile. You're not an inconvenience, Yaya. Don't you talk like that. It came out much harsher than she intended. Yaya's smile faltered, and Kai had an unreadable expression in the hazel eyes he fixed on her, as though he read every thought running through her head. She blinked, turned away hastily. Burning filled her chest, frustration. Why would Yaya ever think such a thing when he was all she had? He was her life, her home. Didn't he know that without him, she had nothing? She chopped furiously, another wave of tears welling up. She swallowed them back determinedly, focused instead on the stinging and aching of her blisters.
See,
said Yaya with another chuckle.
A good girl, that Aranya.
She wasn't going to look. She was going to finish these noodles so they could eat quickly and head off to Konkai Lake. The last thing she was going to do was steal a peek at why it had suddenly gotten so quiet. Phoenix, curse it. She glanced over her shoulder to find Yaya staring into the hearth, but Kai was staring at her. There wasn't a trace of amusement on his face, just contemplation, as though he'd worked out the solution to a difficult puzzle. She shot him a glare and went back to work, trying to distract herself with worry about the fast-declining sun.
Yes,
said Kai belatedly, sighing and sounding like he was standing up.
She's a good girl.
Aranya's face flushed hot. 11.
Kai tried not to let his gaze drift too often to the backs of Aranya's feet, which were furiously red and a little bloodied in spots. Surely that wasn't because of the water he left in her boots. He wouldn't let her see the regret on his face. When she served their bowls of food, however, he found his regret was misplaced. One sip of the broth sent him coughing, his eyes watering viciously, and his tongue scalding. "What?" Aranya blinked innocently. "Are you all right? Not used to spicy food?" "That little spicy food?" Kai croaked. He swiped away a tear leaking from his eye. If he accused her of purposefully overspicing his food, she'd point out the boots. And then they'd get in a fight in front of her grandcat. So Kai found himself grumbling. "I love spicy food," and carefully began eating, dodging the floating flakes of pepper that should have been strained out. The edge of his sleeve was damp from tears after only a few minutes, and he desperately needed to blow his nose. Yaya kept conversation light throughout their meal, asking all manner of what he probably supposed were harmless questions. It was obvious to Kai that he wasn't aware of their rivalry, which was probably why he kept talking her up to him, as though he thought there was a possibility of something romantic between them. Had he not seen them fighting in the yard just minutes ago? At least this meal was proving as enlightening as he expected. Understanding one's enemies was the key to beating them. Not that he was afraid of losing to Aranya, but with every word out of Yaya's mouth, the thought of winning their rivalry turned his stomach a little sourer. From what Kai had seen, he was a sharp man in rapid decline. His chopsticks shook in his hands, and he frequently dropped bites that Aranya quickly picked up for him with a bright smile. A few times, she even dabbed his mouth with a kerchief, which always made Yaya chuckle. Kai had meant what he had said. She was a good girl. An annoying one, perhaps, unbelievably reckless, and also merciless in her revenge, but a good-hearted girl. It seemed so ironic to him, watching her and Yaya grin at each other, how someone with so little family could have so full an affection. Yaya proclaimed the meal the best he'd ever had, and gave Kai a knowing look that he wasn't quite sure how to interpret. Later tonight, or tomorrow, when no one was awake, he'd slip in and replenish the food he'd eaten. It seemed they were under enough strain to keep them both fed, without his uninvited third mouth eating up their food. He'd do that after he dealt with the issue of the incarcerated hidden ones. As Yaya slurped up the last of his food, Aranya watching him carefully, Kai sighed and set down his bowl. "Thank you for the meal," he said to her, while smiling and dabbing away a tear. Father's, but his chest burned like it was on fire. She smiled sweetly as she took his bowl. "Anytime." "You'll have to join me in my tenement for a meal one of these days," Kai said as he stood. Yaya's face split in a wide, toothy grin. "Why, that would be a delight." Aranya's gaze sharpened suddenly, glancing suspiciously between them, and Kai couldn't help smiling just a little bit. That's right, partial, he thought, only a touch vindictively. Next time, I'll be the one cooking up something exciting for you. He came around to Yaya's side of the table and squatted next to him, elbows on his knees, wrists dangling. "Then you can decide who makes a better bowl of noodles, me or Aranya." Yaya laughed aloud. It was a crackling, almost gurgling sort of laugh. Rough, but still pleasant. He looked up to find Aranya watching them, her brows pinched, her mouth drawn in a straight line. He offered her a polite smile, then stood. She quickly turned away, long enough for him to scan quickly over the tenement, note the measly amount of firewood, and say to her back, "Thank you again for the food. I'll meet you at the lake." To Yaya, he gave a warm smile and said, "Stay healthy." He strode out of the room, resisting the urge to evanesce and ruffle Aranya's feathers. He'd sleep poorly enough, as it was from all the upcoming evanescing tonight. "Wait, shouldn't we go together?" came her call, just as he shut the door. "What a nice boy," said Yaya, his quavering voice carrying through the wood. "A very pleasant young man." His stomach turned queasy. He regretted eating more with every passing moment. What if he just disappeared again? Left the appointment to her so she could take care of her grandfather. He could take care of himself, and it would be easier for him to find work than for her to do so. Maybe he could move even farther away, abandon the title of magic-wielder, take on a different name. Father's. He shook his hand. Escaping his family was one thing. Escaping the bureaucracy was an entirely different matter. He'd be a brigand himself, the very thing he was trying to avoid. Indeed, was Aranya's dry as paper reply. "I'm going to go back out. I'll be back as soon as I can, but don't wait up for me." That was Kai's cue to evanesce to his own tenement. He couldn't evanesce there in one leap due to the stupid arrangement of the hallway that put more than one barrier between him and his room. He landed just inside his door. His own much emptier room sprawled before him. The fading sunlight shone through the window on the empty table. Where Aranya's tenement was chaos and clattering pans, his, silent, except for the crunch of something beneath his foot. He looked down to find the corner of yellow parchment sticking out from beneath his toes. For a split second, he closed his eyes and let his stomach drop. Then, he dragged in a deep breath, bent, and retrieved the sealed missive. The once fine paper was dirty from its long journey, made especially long through being forwarded from the fake address he'd given his family. But nothing could disguise the ridiculous flourishes of the writing. In a few steps, he was by the hearth, about to fling the letter onto the coals to burn. Something made him stop. He stared at the paper, dangling from his fingers over black soot. Then, giving into an inexplicable impulse, he pulled it back, broke the seal, and read it. "My dearest brother," it began. Kai barely suppressed a huff. He skipped past the first paragraph, which he knew would contain nothing but false pleasantries, though it was shockingly short today. He started reading at the second paragraph. The handwriting had lost some of its embellishment and was much more uneven than normal. Apparently, this letter had been written in haste. "How can you treat your family this way? Mother is beside herself. Have I not told you 1,000 times how your wayward deeds make her grow worse by the day? I thought you selfish before our father died, but I didn't think you were capable of this. She's dying, and it's because of you. Come back before she loses hope. Unless you truly hate us as much as you act. Then, perhaps this letter gives you all the satisfaction you've craved. Perhaps this was your plan all along. I'll never know what Father saw in you." It went on, but that was enough for Kai. He tossed it in the hearth, stacked up a few logs and tinder, and used a tinderbox to set the fire ablaze. He stared emptily at the flames as they licked around the parchment, swallowing up the elegant signature. Shi Young. He let out a deep sigh, lowered his head into his hand. No. He couldn't give up this Su Shui appointment. He glanced up at the window, at the shadows lengthening around him. There was no delaying any further. Even though he just wanted to sleep, not hunt more brigands, but he had to go. He stood up, sighing, and straightened his shoulders. First, he had to stop by the armory to pilfer some weapons. Then, Kai Lake. "Hope you're well prepared, Partial," he muttered.
By the time she reached Kai Lake, Aranya's joints ached, and her muscles quivered with exhaustion and the after effects of her earlier adrenaline rush. It had been agony to pull her boots back on, but she'd managed it and walked all the way out here. The light slipped into darkness, the dusk nearly swallowed by night. No sign of their target. No sign of Kai. The thought of him brought a host of bewilderment that hadn't been there before. It was simple before. He was her rival. He was rude and arrogant. She hated him and would do whatever it took to beat him out of this appointment. But he'd been unexpectedly and, dare she say it, seemingly genuine with Yaya. She wished it meant nothing to her. After all, they'd been fighting right beforehand. His attentiveness to Yaya, whatever its motivation, hadn't meant nothing to her. Maybe there was a chance she misjudged him. Maybe he wasn't as bad as he had always seemed. Or perhaps he was simply trying to win her trust so he could stab her in the back when she least expected it. As she approached the lake shore, she moved slowly and clung to the shadows. It was so dark now she could barely see where she was going, and she made a few unfortunate twig-cracking steps. Still no Kai. He probably planned to stay hidden while Aranya made the first attack. The waning moon had risen, casting thin silvery light over the tranquil, reflective surface of the lake, before hoofbeats rumbled in the quiet. Her gut clenched, adrenaline surging furiously, as she crouched lower against the base of a stout tree. Carefully, she leaned out to catch a glimpse. Over the stretch of water, 5 black horses and riders emerged from the darkness. From this distance, they seemed more wraith than human. Shudders crawled down her spine, but she gritted her teeth and silently flicked her hands into talons. She got the distinct impression they were a lot more dangerous than she'd originally hoped. She pursed her lips and slunk toward the shadow of the next tree, closer to her quarry. A black form appeared right in front of her. Aranya would have squealed if 2 hands hadn't covered her mouth immediately. Then she would have clawed his brains out if a low voice hadn't growled, "It's me, Kai." He removed his hands and crouched beside her. She glanced sidelong at him, barely able to distinguish his face from the rest of him. Why did she suddenly feel uncomfortable being this close to him? Was it because she was beginning to wonder if there was more to him than what she'd always seen? "I volunteer as bait," she whispered. He gave the faintest snort.
"If you want to die an idiot, Partial, then by all means."
"What's wrong with you? You're supposed to do your fancy evanescing and catch them by surprise while they're occupied with me."
"With 5? I'd say your suggestion is stupid, but I'm actually quite flattered."
Never mind thinking he was different. Clearly, he was still rude and arrogant. She shot him a glare and got the impression he was winking at her. She'd protest his insults, but talking too much might give them away. Instead, she growled, "Then what do we do?"
"We get names."
"We spy?"
"I spy. You're louder than a new lights parade."
"I'm quiet."
"I heard you from several li away, Partial."
"Will you stop calling me that?" Kai stood slowly, ignoring her and keeping his eyes fixed on the opposite shore.
"You can leave now. I'll get the names and bring them to Chigang."
"And take all the credit? I don't think so." He turned his head down to her, but she couldn't make out his expression.
"Then stay here and keep your rear end out of trouble."
He returned his attention to the lake, starting to stand. She grabbed his sleeve, forcing him to look back at her again. "Are you just going to vanish on me again? You've got to at least tell me the plan." He plucked her grip off him and dusted his sleeve.
"The plan is that I will get closer and you will stay put."
"What if you get in trouble?" Another quiet snort that was no less arrogant for its softness. Then he muttered under his breath,
"I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight."
"What? Why?"
"Hmm?"
She had his sleeve in her fist again, keeping him from standing, but not keeping him from evanescing. He let out an irritable sigh, but didn't vanish. "Why won't you be able to sleep tonight?" she pressed. "Because you will be lying awake trying to come up with clever comebacks?" "Just because you need all night to come up with something clever doesn't mean the rest of us do." She gave a silent huff. Why had she ever doubted her initial perception of him? Around them, the darkness deepened, the stillness punctuated by the gentle hum of summer bugs and croaking frogs. The shadows across the lake hardly moved, like they were statues made of night. Finally, Kai said, almost too softly to hear, "The more I evanesce, the harder it gets to fall asleep." Something about the way he said it made it sound like a confession. And it was one, of sorts. Magic-wielders didn't often trust others with knowledge of their magic's limits. In some cases, like Aranya's, it was basically impossible to hide limits. And in a setting like the Academy, it was even more difficult. But in Kai's case, his limits were less clear. She'd already surmised that he couldn't evanesce other people, but he didn't have trouble evanescing objects on his person like his weapons and the clothes he wore. Thank the fathers for that. But insomnia as a result of evanescing? That sounded ridiculous. Aranya raised one eyebrow. "I don't know if I believe you." "Believe what you want." "Is that why you're not a morning person? Because it takes you a long time to fall asleep after you've been evanescing?" He gave a short chuckle. Then he vanished. Her eyes shuddered, a deep breath whooshing out of her. She'd believed it again for a second there, that he wasn't just an arrogant, cheeling-brained jerk. She was a fool to think him sharing one of his evanescing limits meant she had a tiny smidge of his trust. He was probably just pulling her leg after that wretchedly spicy bowl of noodles she'd given him. It didn't matter. Catching these criminals mattered. She rose from her crouch and edged closer to the next tree, then the next. She wouldn't attack, of course, but getting a little closer would help her assess the situation better. Maybe she could hear them talking. And if Kai found himself in trouble, she needed to be available to help. She patted the 2-slotted jian on her belt, a weapon she could shoot from a distance. Kai might be right that having her close would pose more risk than necessary, but that didn't mean she couldn't be prepared if things went awry. The exhaustion in her body was heavy, but she had never been more awake in her life as she eased along the edge of the lake. She kept to the trees, moving as quietly as she could while remaining silent. New lights parade, whatever. She was very quiet. The black horses stomped their hooves impatiently, one tossing its head and dancing against the restraint of its bit and bridle. She could not tell from here if the 5 wraith-like forms on the opposite shore spoke, but she could tell the moment all of them turned toward the line of trees where she imagined Kai would be hiding. Her heart sank. 3 of the riders dismounted, stalking toward the trees. One cupped his hands together, and when he pulled them apart, light glowed between his palms. A fire wielder. Were these brigands too? They had to be. They must have heard Kai. She could not discern the magic of the other forms, but by the way they moved, she doubted she wanted to find out. Swiftly, she unholstered her jian, slotted 2 arrows, and snapped it into firing mode. When she lifted the weapon, her arm shook with fatigue, but bracing and clenching herself steady never worked. She exhaled slowly, and her firing arm steadied. She lowered it until her sights lined up with her target, the fire wielder. The brigand pulled back his arm to launch his fireball. Was the range too far for her weapon? Even if she missed, they would hear the arrows and be distracted from Kai long enough for him to find out the information they needed. Maybe? She didn't have time to wait. She fired.